The Atlantic Ocean was a vast, indifferent expanse. 3,000 miles of rolling salt water, shifting from the steel gray of the north to the abysmal blue of the tropics. In 1942, this was the most important battlefield on Earth. It was not a battle of lines on a map, but a battle of calories, fuel, and raw steel. If the flow of merchant ships from the Americas to the British Isles could be severed, the war was over. London would starve, the Allied resistance would collapse, and for a long, terrifying stretch of time, it looked as though that was exactly what was going to happen. By the midsummer of 1942, the German U-boat arm, the U-boot Waffe, was at the absolute zenith of its power. They called it the Second Happy Time. Off the coast of the United States, from the outer banks of North Carolina to the mouth of the Mississippi, German captains were operating with almost total impunity. Merchant ships, silhouetted against the bright lights of American coastal cities that refused to enforce blackouts, were sitting ducks. The Atlantic had become a graveyard of burning oil and twisted iron. Submarines were no longer just a component of the German Navy, they were Germany's primary strategy for victory. The man behind this strategy was Admiral Karl Donitz. A lean, austere figure with a singular, obsessive focus, Donitz believed that the U-boat was the only weapon capable of knocking Britain out of the war. He didn't need to sink the Royal Navy's battleships, he only needed to sink their supply ships faster than they could be built. He called it the tonnage war. The U-boat, Donitz would often say, is a weapon of the hunt. And in 1942, the hunters were winning. The Type 7 and Type 9 submarines were the predators of the deep, cramped, diesel-scented machines of war that could stay at sea for weeks, waiting in the darkness for the silhouette of a convoy. When the wolf pack struck, they didn't just sink ships, they tore the heart out of the Allied supply line. In a single month, over 700,000 tons of shipping were sent to the bottom. The German High Command was ecstatic. Hitler, who had always been skeptical of the Navy, was finally convinced. The U-boat was the silver bullet. Resources were poured into the shipyards of Kiel, Hamburg, and Bremen. The goal was 300 U-boats at sea at all times. With that number, Donitz promised, the Atlantic would be closed forever. But then, the gears of the machine began to grind. At the height of their success, something shifted. It wasn't a sudden explosion or a lost battle, it was a creeping paralysis. In the offices of the Kriegsmarine, the charts began to show a terrifying trend. Construction times for new boats were stretching from months into years. The flow of steel, once a river, was becoming a trickle. By late 1942, just as the offensive should have been reaching its crescendo, German U-boat production began to slow. Then it did the unthinkable. It stopped. The world watched as the gray wolves began to vanish from the maps. The Allied intelligence services were baffled. Had the bombing raids finally hit the mark? Had the German economy collapsed? No one could explain why the most successful weapon in the German arsenal was suddenly being mothballed. The truth was far more complex and far more devastating. To understand the collapse of German submarine production, one must look past the propaganda and into the cold, hard numbers of the German industrial machine. On paper, by the end of 1942, Germany should have been unstoppable. They had the shipyards, the massive Blom and Voss docks in Hamburg were some of the most advanced in the world. They had the steel. Conquered territories from France to the Ukraine provided a wealth of raw materials. They had the trained crews, young men raised on the ideology of the Reich, eager to prove their worth in the iron coffins. They even had revolutionary new designs on the drawing boards, the Type 21 Electro boat, a submarine so advanced it would make every Allied escort ship obsolete overnight. Yet, despite these advantages, the production lines were quietly being shut down. The first signs were seen in the delays. A Type 7 boat that normally took 9 months to complete was now taking 15. Orders for dozens of new vessels were suddenly canceled or postponed indefinitely. Resources were being redirected, but not to the Luftwaffe or the Eastern Front. They were being pulled into a black hole of bureaucracy and radical, untested engineering. The official explanation, whispered in the corridors of Berlin, was simple: Allied bombing. The British RAF and the American USAAF had begun round-the-clock bombing of German industrial centers. The shipyards were prime targets, but the bombs were a nuisance. They weren't the cause of the halt. The German industry had become incredibly resilient, moving production underground into massive concrete bunkers like Valentine and Bremen, structures so thick no bomb of the era could pierce them. The real reason for the shutdown was a crisis of confidence that reached the very top of the naval command. Even when submarines were being completed, when they were launched into the water, commissioned, and sent out on their maiden voyages, they weren't surviving. Not just in battle, but in the transit zones. The happy times ended with a sudden violent finality. In May 1943, a month the U-boat crews would forever remember as Black May, Germany lost 41 submarines in a single 30-day period. It was a slaughter. For every merchant ship sunk, Germany was now losing a U-boat. The math of the tonnage war had flipped. It was no longer sustainable. But the most disturbing part wasn't the number of losses, it was the nature of the losses. Admiral Donitz sat in his headquarters staring at the radio logs. He was waiting for reports from his captains, reports of kills, of positions, of fuel levels. Instead, there was silence. Submarines would depart from the massive concrete pens in Lorient or Saint-Nazaire, wave goodbye to the shore, and simply cease to exist. The production lines were stopped not just because of a lack of steel, but because the German leadership realized they were building death traps. They were sending their best men into a meat grinder they didn't understand. The transition to the wonder weapons, the Type 21s, was supposed to be the answer. This was the secret reason often cited in high-level meetings, the decision to stop building the obsolete Type 7s and focus entirely on the new, high-tech modular submarines. But this decision was a catastrophic gamble. The new boats were being built in sections across Germany and then transported by canal to be welded together. It was a revolutionary manufacturing technique. It was also a disaster. The sections, built by slave laborers and rushed by frantic engineers, often didn't fit together. Gaps of several inches had to be forced shut. The structural integrity of the hulls was compromised before they ever touched the water. The secret reason for the production halt was that the Germans tried to jump a decade in technology overnight, and in doing so, they had broken their own industrial spine. But even this doesn't explain the full horror of what was happening at sea. As 1943 bled into 1944, a shadow fell over the U-boat arm that no amount of engineering could fix. It was a psychological rot born from a terrifying mystery. Entire U-boat patrols were vanishing without a trace. In the early years of the war, a U-boat sinking was documented. There would be a battle, a depth charge attack, perhaps a distress signal, or at least a last known position. But now, boats were disappearing in areas where there were no convoys, no Allied destroyers, and no known minefields.
The Bay of Biscay, the gateway for every U-boat heading to the Atlantic, became a valley of death. One German commander, who survived a harrowing journey only to be interrogated by his superiors, wrote in his private diary, "They are not sinking in battle. They are disappearing. We feel the eyes of the enemy upon us, even in the fog, even in the dead of night. The sea has become a transparent cage." Something was killing the submarines before the enemy ever saw them, or rather, before the Germans saw the enemy. The secret was a technological leap the Germans refused to believe was possible. The Allies had developed the Lee Light, a massive, powerful searchlight mounted on long-range bombers, combined with a new 10-centimeter radar that German sensors couldn't detect. Imagine the scene. A U-boat is running on the surface at night, recharging its batteries. The crew feels safe in the pitch black of the ocean. Suddenly, the entire world turns blindingly white. A high-intensity beam of light, millions of candle power, drops from the clouds. Before the bridge crew can even scream alarm, the depth charges are already in the air. But there was something even darker than the Lee Light. The reports of disappearing boats began to include vessels that were deep underwater, far from any aircraft. The Germans began to suspect their own equipment. They suspected their hulls were failing under the pressure of the deep, that the modular construction of the newer boats was causing them to implode. There are stories whispered among the few survivors of the ghost patrols. These were boats that would check in via radio, reporting calm seas and no contact, only to never be heard from again. No wreckage was ever found by Allied or Axis ships. No bodies ever washed ashore. In one instance, U-533 was lost in the Gulf of Oman. For decades, it was a mystery. When the wreck was finally found years later, it wasn't torn apart by explosives. It was sitting upright on the seabed, perfectly intact, except for a single small hole in the hull. The German High Command realized that the U-boat had lost its greatest weapon, invisibility. And without invisibility, a submarine is nothing more than a slow, vulnerable coffin. By the time the production lines were supposed to be churning out the wonder submarines, the heart of the U-boat Waffe had been cut out. The veteran commanders were dead, the new recruits were terrified, and the secret reason why Germany stopped building submarines was finally clear to the men in the bunkers. They had realized that the ocean was no longer their ally. It had become a vast blue trap, and every new boat they launched was simply a waste of lives and steel in a war that had already been lost beneath the waves. The silence of the Atlantic was no longer the silence of the hunter, it was the silence of the grave. The long-form narrative, the Atlantic ghost. To understand the sheer scale of the catastrophe, one must step inside the pressure hull of a Type 7C U-boat. It is a world of unrelenting claustrophobia. 60 men live in a space no larger than a small apartment, surrounded by the hum of electric motors and the heavy, sweet, sour smell of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and rotting food. The walls are always damp with sweat, condensation that drips from the cold steel onto the bunks and the control panels. In 1942, this was the environment of winners. The men who sailed these boats felt like the masters of the world. They were the gray wolves, the elite of the Kriegsmarine. When they returned to the pens in occupied France, they were greeted with brass bands, fresh flowers, and the personal congratulations of Admiral Dönitz. But the secret reason for the end of the U-boat war wasn't just a single decision. It was a slow-motion car crash involving technology, industrial hubris, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy's resolve. The tech that failed. At the heart of the U-boat success was the Enigma machine. The Germans believed their codes were unbreakable. This belief was the foundation of their entire strategy. Dönitz coordinated his wolf packs via radio, sending detailed instructions to boats spread across thousands of miles. What he didn't know, what the secret reports failed to grasp until it was too late, was that the British had cracked Enigma. Every time a U-boat checked in, the Allies knew exactly where it was. This was the invisible hand that was guiding the destroyers to the submarines. The Germans, however, blamed their equipment. They thought the Allies were detecting their Metox radar warning receivers. They thought the Allies were using heat-seeking torpedoes. They chased ghosts, changing their equipment every few weeks, while the real leak, the radio codes, remained wide open. This internal confusion led to a complete breakdown in the engineering department. They stopped building standard boats to fix problems that didn't exist, leading to a production paralysis that lasted for months. While the engineers were chasing technological ghosts, Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, was trying to revolutionize how the boats were built. Before 1943, a U-boat was built from the keel up in a single shipyard. It was a slow, artisanal process. Speer wanted a Ford-style assembly line. He ordered the new Type 21 boats to be built in 8 separate sections at 30 different inland factories. These sections would then be shipped by barge to the coast and welded together. It sounded brilliant. On paper, it would triple production. But Germany in 1944 was a nation under siege. The inland factories were staffed by forced laborers who had every reason to sabotage the work. The canal systems were being bombed daily. When the sections finally arrived at the shipyards, they were warped. The bolt holes didn't line up. The electrical wiring was mismatched. The secret reason Germany stopped building submarines was that they physically lost the ability to assemble them. In the final year of the war, dozens of nearly finished Type 21 U-boats sat in the shipyards, useless hunks of advanced technology that couldn't be made watertight. They were monuments to a dream that had turned into a nightmare. The human cost. By the end of the war, the statistics were staggering. Of the 40,000 men who served in the U-boat arm, 30,000 never came home. That is a 75% casualty rate, the highest of any branch of service in any military in modern history. The U-boat was a weapon that required absolute precision and absolute courage. When the German High Command realized that their wonder weapons were failures and their old boats were death traps, they didn't stop the war. They just stopped the production of the tools that gave their men a chance at fighting. The U-boats that did sail in 1945 were often museum pieces, older models sent out on suicide missions to tie down Allied forces. They were ghosts of a fleet that had once held the world by the throat. The secret reason Germany stopped building submarines wasn't a lack of will, it was the realization that they were no longer fighting a war they could win with steel and oil. They were fighting a war of information and physics, and in that arena, the gray wolves were already extinct. The story of the U-boats is a story of how a weapon of the future became a relic of the past in the span of just 3 years. It is a reminder that in the cold, dark depths of the Atlantic, the most dangerous thing isn't the enemy you can see, it's the enemy you can't. And for the men of the Kriegsmarine, the silence of the sea eventually became the silence of history.
By the early months of 1944, the atmosphere within the U-boat Wafa headquarters had shifted from one of aggressive determination to a cold, suffocating dread. The maps on the walls of Admiral Donitz's command center told a story of tactical defeat, but the secret dossiers circulating among the naval architects at the U-boat Konstruktionsbüro told a story of a deeper, more fundamental rot. The Kriegsmarine had spent years perfecting the art of the hunt, training their crews to withstand depth charges, ASDIC pings, and the freezing North Atlantic gales. But as the new wonder weapons, the Type 21 Electro boats began their initial deep dive trials, a horrifying pattern emerged. The enemy wasn't the British Royal Navy or the American Liberty ships. The enemy was the very machine the German sailors were being asked to inhabit. Internal German investigations, conducted in the utmost secrecy, began to uncover a series of structural failures that defied the Reich's reputation for engineering excellence. New submarines, fresh from the shipyards and supposedly representing the pinnacle of naval technology, were failing before they even reached the front lines. The reports were chilling. During test dives in the relatively shallow waters of the Baltic, engineers began to document spontaneous structural deformations. These weren't the result of combat, they were the result of the ocean's crushing weight finding the weaknesses the Germans had built into their own hulls. The breakdown of the industrial machine. To understand why this was happening, one must look at the state of German industry in the final years of the war. Under the direction of Albert Speer, the Reich had transitioned to total war production. The goal was no longer precision, it was volume. To achieve the impossible production targets set by Hitler, corners weren't just cut, they were decimated. The first victim of this frantic pace was the steel itself. The high-grade, nickel-hardened steel required for deep-diving hulls became a luxury the Reich could no longer afford. As Allied blockades choked off the supply of rare alloys, German metallurgists were forced to use ersatz steel, cheaper, more brittle substitutes that looked identical to the real thing but lacked the molecular elasticity to survive the immense pressures of the deep. In the shipyards of Hamburg and Danzig, the degradation of quality was even more visible. The Type 21 was designed to be built in sections, but the labor force was increasingly composed of starved, exhausted slave laborers and political prisoners. These men, working under the threat of execution, had no incentive to ensure the structural integrity of the boats. Welding, the very sinew that held the pressure hull together, became the fatal flaw.
Standard operating procedures required multiple passes of welding, followed by X-ray inspections to detect air pockets or slag. But under the pressure of the Spear Plan, these inspections were shortened or skipped entirely. The ocean noticed what the inspectors ignored. At the surface, a poor weld is a minor defect. At a depth of 600 feet, where the pressure exerted on every square inch of the hull is measured in tons, a poor weld is a death warrant. The internal reports noted that during deep diving trials, hairline cracks were appearing along the longitudinal seams of the hulls. These weren't just leaks, they were the sound of a submarine screaming before it shattered. The true nature of the catastrophe was finally laid bare when a German salvage team recovered the wreckage of a boat that had vanished during a routine training exercise. This wasn't a vessel lost to the Atlantic, it was lost in the safe waters of the training grounds, in an area where no Allied aircraft or ships could possibly have operated. When the engineers first viewed the wreckage, they expected to see the telltale signs of a collision or an internal explosion. Instead, what they found was a scene of scientific horror. The submarine hadn't been attacked by an outside force. It had imploded with such violence and speed that the physics of the event were almost impossible to process. The pressure hull, designed to be a rigid cylinder of steel, had been crushed like a tin can under a boot. Inside the wreckage, the investigators found a frozen tragedy. Because the implosion had occurred in a fraction of a second, there was no evidence of a struggle. There were no spent fire extinguishers, no emergency breathing apparatuses donned, no signs of an attempt to surface. The crew positions were frozen in place. The men had been dead before their nervous systems could even register the sound of the hull giving way. The physics of 1 second. The lead engineers, examining the structural remains back at the laboratory, reached a conclusion that sent shockwaves through the Naval Command. They calculated that at the submarine's operational combat depth, once a structural failure began, the total collapse of the hull took less than 1 second. At combat depth, the report stated with clinical coldness, survival time was less than the blink of an eye. The discovery meant that dozens of U-boats listed as missing in action hadn't been sunk by the heroic efforts of Allied convoys. They had been death traps from the moment they left the pier. The Germans had been sending their most highly trained crews into the abyss in vessels that were mathematically guaranteed to fail. This realization changed the perspective of the entire war at sea. The German naval architects realized that their wonder weapons, the Type 21 and Type 23, were fundamentally compromised. The modular sections, built in different parts of the country and rushed to the coast, frequently didn't align by several millimeters. To fix this, workers were using hydraulic jacks to force the sections together before welding them. This pre-stressing meant the hulls were under massive internal stress before they even touched the water. When the external pressure of the ocean was added to this internal stress, the steel didn't just bend, it shattered. Every U-boat produced under this system was a ticking bomb, waiting for the depth gauge to hit the critical mark. The discovery of the structural failures presented Admiral Donitz in the High Command with a paralyzing dilemma. By late 1944, the U-boat was the only weapon Germany had left that could even theoretically change the course of the war. Hitler was obsessed with the wonder weapons, believing that a fleet of 100 Type 21 submarines would sweep the Allies from the seas and force a peace treaty. To admit the truth that the German industrial machine was no longer capable of building a watertight boat would have been an act of political suicide. The Great Cover-Up. Admitting the problem would have meant grounding the entire U-boat fleet for months of inspections and refitting. It would have meant exposing the total failure of Albert Speer's modular production system. Most importantly, it would have destroyed the last shred of morale remaining in the U-boat Waffe. If the crews knew that their own boats were more dangerous than the Allied destroyers, they never would have left the docks. So, the Reich did something unthinkable, even by their standards. They buried the evidence. The reports from the salvage teams were classified as top secret Reich only and restricted to a handful of high-ranking officers and engineers. The evidence of structural implosion was reclassified in the official logs. Whenever a boat vanished without a trace, the loss was recorded as enemy action or presumed sunk by aircraft.
In some cases, the blame was shifted directly onto the men who had died. The High Command issued memos blaming operational errors or lack of discipline for the disappearance of vessels. They claimed that commanders were being reckless with their depth limits, rather than admitting the limits themselves were a lie. The quiet end. But even the most fanatical Nazi officers couldn't ignore the reality of the mounting losses. Behind the scenes, the pace of production began to change. While the propaganda films still showed workers frantically assembling boats for the final victory, the actual orders coming from Berlin were changing. Orders for new hulls were quietly slowed. Resources were diverted to repairs that were actually attempts to reinforce the failing seams of existing boats. The massive Valentine bunker, intended to churn out a Type 21 every few days, became a graveyard of half-finished sections that engineers were too afraid to assemble. The secret reason why Germany stopped building submarines wasn't a single strike or a lost battle. It was the realization that the Third Reich had broken its own ability to manufacture reality. They had tried to conquer the ocean with lies, poor steel, and rushed labor, and the ocean had responded with the cold, crushing weight of physics. In the final days of the war, as the Allies closed in on the shipyards of Kiel and Wilhelmshaven, Dönitz ordered the remaining U-boats to be scuttled. He told the world it was to keep the technology out of enemy hands. But looking back at the secret reports and the twisted wreckage of the test boats, one might suspect another reason. Perhaps he wanted to bury the evidence of a failure so total, so catastrophic, that it could never be spoken of. The Grey Wolves didn't just lose the war, they were betrayed by the very regime they served, sent to the bottom of the sea in iron coffins that were never meant to survive the deep. The war at sea ended not with a final battle, but with a quiet, shameful halt. The shipyards went silent, the welding torches were extinguished, and the remaining crews were left to wonder how many of their comrades had died not for a cause, but because of a hairline fracture in a piece of second-rate steel. The story of the U-boats is a final, grim testament to the fact that in war, the most dangerous enemy is often the one staring back at you from the blueprints on your own desk. The ultimate tragedy of the German U-boat arm was that in the final hour, their engineers actually succeeded. They had identified the flaws, decoded the physics of the deep, and designed the most advanced naval vessels the world had ever seen. If these boats had appeared in 1942, the world might look very different today. But by 1945, the Third Reich was a dying beast, and its wonder weapons were nothing more than high-tech ghosts. The pinnacle of this desperate engineering was the Type 21 electroboat. It was a radical departure from everything that came before. For the first time in history, a submarine was designed to live under the water, not just hide there. Previous U-boats were essentially surface ships that could submerge for short bursts. The Type 21 was a true predator of the abyss. It featured revolutionary hull geometry, a streamlined figure-8 cross-section that reduced drag and allowed for unprecedented underwater speed. Massive battery capacity. It carried 3 times the electrical power of a standard boat, allowing it to outrun many Allied escort ships while submerged. The quiet run. New rubber-mounted motors made it almost invisible to Allied sonar. Hydraulic reloading. It could fire 18 torpedoes in under 20 minutes, a feat that would have decimated any convoy. But the irony was cruel. By the time the first Type 21, the U-2511, was ready for combat in April 1945, the German war machine was in a state of total systemic collapse. The factories were no longer just failing because of bad steel. They were failing because the sky belonged to the Allies. Every railway line was a twisted wreck. Every fuel depot was a blackened crater. The revolutionary Type 21 required specialized high-capacity batteries and refined components that simply couldn't be transported. Even more devastating was the fuel crisis. A submarine is a hungry machine, and by 1945, Germany was dry. The proud U-boat fleet sat tied to the piers in Wilhelmshaven and Bergen, their tanks empty, their crews watching the horizon for the Allied bombers that came every single day. The secret reason had evolved. It was no longer just about the structural implosions of the rushed models. It was about the total evaporation of the logistics required to support a modern navy. The submarines that could have changed the war were trapped in the very concrete pens built to protect them, becoming high-tech tombs before they ever saw a single merchant ship. As the winter of 1944 bled into the catastrophic spring of 1945, the U-boat war didn't end with a climactic battle. There was no final charge of the Gray Wolves. Instead, the Atlantic campaign dissolved into a haunting industrial silence. The German High Command was still issuing orders, still demanding that boats put to sea, but the reality on the ground had diverged from the maps in Berlin. The U-boat arm was no longer a fighting force. It was a desperate exercise in survival. The secret reason why production finally ground to a total halt was a combination of three terminal factors: the death of the modular dream. The ambitious plan to build submarines in sections across Germany had backfired with poetic justice. As the Red Army advanced from the east and the Western Allies crossed the Rhine, the assembly line was physically severed. The bow of a submarine might be in a factory in Czechoslovakia, while the stern was in a bombed-out shed in Hanover. They would never meet. The modular system, designed for speed, had created a vulnerability that the Allies exploited perfectly: the material exhaustion. The ersatz steel and the rushed welds that had caused the catastrophic implosions in Part 4 were now the only materials available. The naval engineers knew that sending a boat out in 1945 was essentially a death sentence by physics. The structural integrity of the final boats was so poor that many commanders refused to dive below periscope depth, fearing the hull would shatter if they went even a few meters deeper. The collapse of the human spirit. The crews were no longer the cocky volunteers of 1939. They were boys, some as young as 17, shoved into cramped, diesel-fumed hulls with only a few weeks of training. They had heard the rumors of the vanishing patrols. They knew that the wonder weapons were failing. The psychological rot was total. In May 1945, Admiral Donitz, now the successor to Hitler after the Führer's suicide, issued the final order: Operation Regenbow. He ordered the crews to scuttle their own ships. All across the coast of Germany and Norway, the sea was filled with the gurgling sound of opening valves. Hundreds of U-boats, including the advanced Type 21s, slipped beneath the waves one last time. They weren't sunk by depth charges. They were executed by their own men to prevent the world from seeing just how broken the invincible fleet had become. The U-boat war ended not in a final battle, but in a series of oily bubbles and a profound, heavy silence.